The situation in the Middle East right now, it's incredibly tense, a real powder keg, you could say.
Definitely.
We've seen this dramatic escalation, haven't we? Especially between Israel and Iran. And now, these significant U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites.
A major development, yes.
And it immediately makes you ask, okay, what does this actually mean for the world's energy supply? Specifically, what's the impact on the Strait of Hormuz?
It's the unavoidable question, because the Strait of Hormuz, well, it's not just some line on a map. It is quite literally the world's most vital energy artery.
Like the jugular vein for oil and gas.
Exactly that. A perfect analogy.
So in this deep dive, that's precisely what we're going to get into. We want to unpack what Iran's recent threats to shut down this absolutely critical waterway really mean. Our aim here is to give you a clear, concise, but also a deeply informed look at its strategic importance, what Iran can actually do, the potential economic fallout, which is staggering, and of course the international response.
Because this whole situation, it really could reshape global dynamics. Understanding it is key.
Absolutely. We want you to be well-equipped to follow this.
Okay, so maybe let's start with the basics. What exactly is the Strait of Hormuz, and why does it matter so much?
Good place to start.
Geographically speaking, you're looking at a narrow stretch of water. It sits between Oman and the UAE on one side,
Right.
and Iran on the other. And critically, it's the only way ships can get from the Persian Gulf out into the Gulf of Oman and then into the Arabian Sea and the wider ocean. The only way by sea.
And it's that geography, that narrowness, that makes it so, well, vulnerable.
Extremely. At its narrowest point, it's only about, 33 kilometers? That's 21 miles across.
Which sounds like a fair bit, maybe.
It does, but here's the crucial part. The actual shipping lanes, the deep channels that these huge oil tankers have to use, they're just 3 kilometers wide. That's about 2 miles in each direction.
Wow, okay, that's a serious bottleneck, very susceptible to disruption.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the amount of traffic squeezing through there is just immense. We're talking about 1/5 of the world's oil supply.
1/5?
Yes, roughly 20 million barrels every single day, plus a huge chunk of the world's liquefied natural gas, LNG. It adds up to about 20% of total global oil consumption passing through that tiny strait.
You just can't overstate how important that is.
No, you really can't.
And this whole situation, as we said, isn't happening in a vacuum. The geopolitical climate has just escalated incredibly quickly lately.
That's right. The immediate spark, you could say, has been Israel's ongoing operations in Gaza, but also strikes inside Iran itself, starting around June 13th, 2025.
And that's already had knock-on effects, right? We've seen ocean freight rates jump.
A big jump, up 55% month over month. That shows you how sensitive global trade is to instability in this region.
And then came the really unprecedented move. June 22nd, 2025, President Trump ordering the bombing of 3 Iranian nuclear sites.
Yeah, that was a major escalation. The first known direct U.S. strikes against Iran, certainly on Iranian soil, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. It really changes the game.
Unsurprisingly, Iran vowed a response. Their foreign minister, Abbas Araqi, said the U.S. crossed a very big red line.
Strong words. And Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, also warned that Israel made a grave mistake and must be punished.
But interestingly, Khamenei didn't specifically mention the Strait of Hormuz in that statement, did he?
He did not. Which leads us right to the core question everyone's asking. Is Iran's threat to close the strait actually real this time?
Because they have threatened it before.
Many times. It's almost a recurring theme in regional tensions. But, and this is crucial, they've never actually followed through with a full, sustained closure.
So what's held them back? What's the calculation there? And how does this latest move their parliament approving a measure, but the final decision still pending, fit into that?
Well, it seems to be a masterclass in strategic ambiguity, doesn't it? They use the threat of closure as leverage, as a deterrent, a bargaining chip.
Without actually triggering the potentially catastrophic consequences of doing it.
Exactly. It's a high-stakes bluff, essentially.
Yeah.
And this internal process you mentioned, Parliament, approves something on June 23rd, but it needs ratification. The Supreme National Security Council has the final say. The decision is not final. That just highlights the deliberate ambiguity.
And the foreign minister's comment.
Right. Arachi saying a variety of options are available to Iran. It keeps everyone guessing. It keeps the pressure on.
Okay, so if a full closure is that sort of ultimate, maybe improbable step, what else could Iran do? What are the less drastic but still disruptive tactics they might use?
There's a whole spectrum of possibilities short of a full shutdown. One classic tactic is laying sea mines in the strait.
We saw that back in the 80s during the tanker wars.
We did, and even as recently as 2019, the U.S. pointed the finger at Iran for a mine blast affecting tankers. The big risk for Iran, though, is that mines are indiscriminate. They could easily damage their own ships, too.
Risky. What else?
Well, there's their history of directly attacking or seizing commercial vessels. Again, back in the 80s, they targeted ships from various nations. Even the U.S. Navy got involved.
And more recently, too, right? That tanker seizure.
That's right. The Advantage Suite crude tanker seized in April 2023. They held on to it for over a year. That sends a very clear signal about their capabilities and willingness to interfere with shipping.
So direct action is definitely on the table.
It is. Or they could go for slightly softer, but still impactful harassment. Things like ordering ships into Iranian waters illegally, or having their fast boats buzz commercial vessels.
Which sounds less dramatic, but I imagine it still causes problems.
Huge problems. It creates uncertainty, raises insurance costs, and could force shipping companies to demand naval escorts, maybe even use convoys. That slows everything down, makes logistics a nightmare, and drives up costs significantly.
And there's something else happening already, isn't there? GPS jamming.
Yes, that's become a major issue. Since mid-June 2025, reports suggest nearly 1,000 vessels a day are experiencing widespread GPS signal jamming in the area.
1,000 a day.
That's the figure being reported. It makes navigation incredibly difficult, obviously increases the risk of collisions. There was even an oil tanker crash potentially linked to it. It's a way to sow chaos without firing a shot.
And we've seen similar disruption tactics elsewhere recently.
Absolutely. Look at what the Houthi militants did in the Red Sea, using ballistic missiles, sea drones, air drones against merchant ships.
Which forced ships onto that much longer route around Africa.
Exactly, and caused a huge drop, something like 70%, in commercial traffic through the Red Sea and Suez Canal. Iran could definitely try to mirror some of those Houthi tactics in and around Hormuz.
It's also worth remembering, I suppose, that their options aren't just confined to the strait itself.
That's a really important point. They could target critical oil infrastructure elsewhere in the region. Think about Iraq's Basra oil terminals or Saudi Arabia's massive Abqaiq processing facility.
That Abqaiq attack in 2019 was huge, wasn't it?
It was devastating. It knocked out something like 7% of the entire global crude supply almost overnight. The shockwaves from that were immense. So yes, targeting infrastructure outside the strait is definitely in their playbook.
So how would they actually carry out these kinds of actions? What are Iran's military capabilities, especially when facing, say, the U.S. Navy?
Well, Iran knows it can't win a conventional head-to-head fight with the U.S. Navy or Air Force, so they focus on asymmetric tactics.
Meaning?
Meaning they try to exploit weaknesses and avoid direct confrontation where they're outmatched. For their Navy, that likely means prioritizing attacks on civilian shipping, using things like small, fast attack craft, and especially their submarines.
Submarines.
Yes, they have Ghadir-class mini-subs and older Kilo-class submarines. Some reports suggest these have anechoic tiles, which make them much harder to detect with sonar. Ideal for ambushing commercial ships or laying mines stealthily.
So guerrilla tactics at sea, basically.
Kind of, yes. And because their Air Force and Surface Navy are relatively limited for a sustained fight, they would rely very heavily on their missile capabilities as a deterrent.
They have a lot of missiles, right?
They do. They've invested heavily in coastal defense batteries, mobile anti-ship cruise missiles like the Fajar-3, the Noor system positioned on islands like Kishim and Hangam, right there in the strait. They've got military radar covering the area.
And those underground bases they talk about?
They claim to have developed more underground missile facilities, yes, which makes targeting them harder. It's all about projecting threat and deterrence.
They also have some newer naval assets.
Yes, things like new missile catamarans, the Shahid Soleimani, Shahid Rudaki, which apparently have vertical launch systems for surface-to-air missiles, and hovercraft, like the BH-7s.
What's the advantage of those?
Speed and surprise. They allow Iran to potentially move forces quickly onto strategic islands within the strait, perhaps to seize key positions in a limited conflict, or install missile launchers temporarily. Rapid force projection.
It's a complex picture, but what's really striking is the economic side of this. For Iran itself, U.S. officials have been very blunt about it.
Extremely blunt. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Vice President J.D. Vance, they basically said closing the strait would be economic suicide for Iran.
Even while acknowledging it would hurt other countries a lot worse.
Right, and that phrase, economic suicide, it really captures the core dilemma for Tehran. Their biggest point of leverage controlling Hormuz is also their economic Achilles heel.
Because they rely on it too.
Massively. not just for their own limited oil exports now, but for importing essential goods. Shutting it down harms them immensely. It's this inherent contradiction that probably explains why they've always pulled back from a full closure before. It forces a kind of pragmatic self-preservation, despite the rhetoric.
But for the rest of the world, the immediate shock would be intense.
Oh, absolutely. Oil prices would just skyrocket. Goldman Sachs was estimating maybe above $100 a barrel. JP Morgan analysts suggested potentially an almost 70% surge.
A 70% jump. That hits everyone's wallet.
Everywhere. Energy is fundamental. That surge feeds directly into higher production costs for almost everything. Food, clothes, chemicals, transport, you name it.
Which means higher inflation globally.
Definitely higher inflation and slower economic growth as businesses and consumers pull back. It could even force central banks, who are already walking a tightrope, to delay planned interest rate cuts.
And thinking about specific countries and alliances, China seems particularly exposed.
Hugely exposed. China buys the vast majority, almost 90% of Iran's current oil exports. That's around 1.6 million barrels a day. A shutdown hits them very hard, creating massive political and economic pressure.
And the Gulf Arab states.
They'd be under immense pressure, too. They rely heavily on the strait for their own exports. A closure could risk dragging them into the conflict to protect their own economic lifelines, especially since their alternatives are limited.
So it could widen the conflict significantly.
Potentially, yes. And you'd likely see universal condemnation even from countries usually neutral or friendly towards Iran, like China and India. They need that oil flow. It would probably lead to even tougher international sanctions on Iran.
But there is some historical perspective here, maybe a bit of a buffer.
Yes, that's true. History shows that even severe disruptions to oil supply, think about the 2003 Iraq War, or the initial shock after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, tend to be relatively short-lived in their most extreme impact.
Why is that?
A couple reasons. Often, there's some spare production capacity elsewhere in the world that can be brought online, and also simple economics. When prices spike dramatically, demand tends to fall, which helps rebalance the market over time.
And we have global stockpiles, too.
We do. There's a pretty healthy buffer, estimated at least 5.8 billion barrels of crude oil and refined fuels stockpiled globally. In a worst-case total shutdown of Hormuz, that's equivalent to about 9.5 months of the typical flow through the strait.
9.5 months. That's a significant cushion against immediate disaster.
It provides breathing room, definitely. It prevents an instant catastrophe.
Okay, what about bypassing the strait altogether? Are there alternative routes? Pipelines?
There are a few, but their capacity is limited. Saudi Arabia has the big east-west pipeline, the petrol line. Its capacity is nominally quite large, maybe 5 to 7 million barrels per day.
Okay.
And the UAE has a pipeline from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, bypassing Hormuz. That's about 1.6 million barrels per day capacity.
And Iran has one, too.
Iran built the Gorjask pipeline to bypass Hormuz as well, but its capacity is much smaller, maybe 0.3 million barrels per day, and reportedly it hasn't even been used since September 2024.
So you add those up.
You add up the effective unused capacity in the Saudi and UAE pipelines, and you're probably looking at only around 3.5 million barrels per day combined.
Which sounds like a lot, but compared to the 20 million barrels a day that usually goes through the strait.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's nowhere near enough to mitigate the full impact of a closure. It helps at the margins, provides some relief for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but it doesn't solve the global problem. It's a stopgap, not a replacement.
So bringing it all together, the verdict on a full prolonged closure seems pretty clear.
Yes, the consensus among experts is that while it's the ultimate nightmare scenario, a full closure lasting more than, say, a few hours or days, certainly a week or more, is considered highly unlikely, improbable even.
And a big part of that improbability comes down to international law, right?
Absolutely. The Strait of Hormuz is legally classified as an international strait. Its passage is governed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and USS.
And what does UNCUSA say?
It guarantees the right of transit passage for all ships and aircraft through such straits. Basically, ships have the right to pass through continuously and expeditiously without delay.
So legally, Iran just can't block it.
Not legally, no. A full closure targeting all ships would be a clear breach of international law, specifically customary international law regarding transit passage. Iran might claim security reasons allow restrictions, but a total blockade would violate these established norms.
And violations of international law usually provoke a response.
A strong response.
Yeah.
Particularly from Western powers who rely on that free flow of commerce. They would almost certainly act forcefully to protect shipping.
Which brings us to the military dimension of the response. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is based nearby.
Right there in Bahrain. Its core mission is ensuring maritime security, safe navigation, free flow of commerce in the region. They are constantly prepared for contingencies involving the strait.
And they've taken specific steps. Marines on standby.
Yes. Back in August 2023, the U.S. deployed Marines specifically with the potential mission of escorting merchant shipping through the strait if necessary. They're positioned to act.
And technologically, they have an edge. You mentioned unmanned systems.
A significant edge. Since around September 2023, the Fifth Fleet has been actively integrating unmanned platforms, underwater drones, surface drones, aerial drones, with their traditional crewed ships and aircraft.
Manned-unmanned teaming, they call it.
That's the term. It essentially gives them vastly more eyes and ears on and under the water, 24/7. Greatly improves their situational awareness, lets them spot threats like mines or small boats much earlier, and generally increases deterrence because Iran knows it's being watched so closely.
And in terms of conventional firepower, air power especially,
there's really no comparison. U.S. air assets like the F-22 Raptor, the F-35 Lightning II-6, they're generations ahead of Iran's older fleet F-14s from before the revolution, F-5s, F-4s, some Russian MiG-29s and Su-24s.
So Iranian air support wouldn't last long in a real fight?
Military analysts estimate maybe 24 to 48 hours at most before they'd be overwhelmed. That lack of air cover severely limits Iran's ability to sustain any kind of surface naval blockade against a determined opponent.
Some observers have even drawn parallels to past operations.
Yes. Some suggest a U.S. response could look like Operation Praying Mantis from the Iran-Iraq War in 1988, where the U.S. Navy decisively crippled Iranian naval forces after a U.S. ship hit an Iranian mine.
But maybe on a larger scale now?
Potentially, yes.
Yes.
On a larger scale with much more advanced weaponry? There's even been stark commentary suggesting such an operation could effectively turn Iran's surface navy into, well, submarines. Sunk, essentially.
A grim prospect. It really underlines that a full closure attempt would be seen as
a casus belli. A justification for war, not just potentially with the U.S. and allies, but it could easily draw the Gulf Arab states into a much wider regional conflict to protect their own vital interests. The stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just quickly crystallize those key takeaways. The Strait of Hormuz, undeniably, critically important, handles a massive slice of the world's energy.
Absolutely. And Iran does have a whole toolkit of disruptive options, ranging from, laying mines and harassing ships to potentially striking vessels or even targeting oil facilities outside the strait itself.
But, and this is the crucial, but a full sustained closure is widely seen as highly improbable.
Highly improbable. Because of international law, because of the overwhelming military superiority of the U.S. and its allies ready to intervene, and maybe most critically, because it would be, as officials put it, economic suicide for Iran itself.
And while any major disruption would cause severe economic pain, globally spiking oil prices, inflation, it would likely be somewhat cushioned by global stockpiles and those limited alternative pipelines, and probably wouldn't last indefinitely.
That seems to be the consensus, yes. Painful, but likely not apocalyptic in the long run, assuming it doesn't escalate into a much wider war.
So thinking about all this fragile balance we see here, you've got economic necessity bumping up against international law, overshadowed by military power, all playing out in this incredibly volatile region. What does that really tell us about how interconnected global energy security is and how a shadow of conflict is, well, always present? How does understanding these dynamics, the bluffing, the red lines, the economic realities, the military calculations, how does that help you, listening now, to better read between the lines of future headlines, to maybe sort out the real risks from the saber rattling? It's definitely something to keep thinking about and certainly a situation to keep a very close eye on.